Hey everybody, welcome to week 7 of PS 398. So we're about to hit the main module of the class. Sort of everything that we've been doing up to this point has been antecedent action. We've been just making sure that you have a rough sense about what this all looks like, almost from an aesthetic standpoint. But it's finally come time for us to talk about games and what game theory has to do with international relations. Game theory is a branch of political science and the social sciences more generally. It is a kind of applied mathematical social science, and it also is part of rational choice theory. So in that sense, game theory is very similar to what you've seen up to this point, most of which has been decision theory, what is rationality and how do we model decision makers in isolation, social choice theory, like Arrow's theorem, or some of the rudiments of Pareto optimality as it relates to both bargaining and exchange-oriented processes. And at the end of every lecture, I've said, oh, and there's great promise in this approach. Oh, and there's great promise in this approach. And oh, there's great promise in this approach. And so you might be thinking, well, why are we deviating to some other approach? And the answer is, even though there is great promise in each of the approaches that we've discussed up to this point, none of them is able to capture strategic interdependence quite the same way that game theory does. Game theory very much is the study of strategic interdependence. What is it for decision makers who are rational, which you now know something about? What is it for them to have preferences over outcomes that aren't just determined by their choices? So up to this point, what a decision maker gets has been entirely conditioned by their own choices. If I'm a rational decision maker with hawk, dove, and owl, if I choose hawk, then I get hawk. Or maybe I choose a lottery that gives me some set of probabilities over hawk, dove, and owl. However, that is still my choice. I still have perfect agency over the outcome in a probabilistic sense. At least up to the probabilistic realization of the iron dice rolling, I have complete agency in that process. Or if I'm a consumer in an Edgeworth box, I purchase the bundle. There is nothing about strategic interdependence at work. The only interdependence that we see in the Edgeworth box was because of the interdependence generated by the market mechanism itself. It wasn't that individual choices directly led to outcomes that then the decision makers had preferences over. What makes game theory is that we're going to be modeling strategic interdependence explicitly, in the sense that my choice plus your choice yields some outcome, and then we have preferences over those outcomes. The idea is that our choices simultaneously combine to create an outcome. That's all that game theory is the rigorous study of that very thing. And we've all been there before, right? We've all had a sense that the outcome of some particular thing that we cared about didn't just depend on our actions. We oftentimes have the sense that other actors are involved. I hope that by the end of today's lecture, you will have seen how you relate to this problem of strategic interdependence, which is all around you to the point that you might not even notice it. It's almost like it's water or something. Isn't this all water? However, even if you don't feel personal kinship to the problem of strategic interdependence, you live on an island all by yourself and you've never had something that was determined both by your choices and somebody else's choices. You're that person. Congratulations. I'm Rob. Send for help. I'll call. Do you need me to call? I'll help. Just let me know. But even if you're that person, I'm assuming that you would agree with me that what states do does not happen in strategic isolation. When a state makes a choice to start a war or fight a war at a particular level, or to issue a sanction and then wait to see if everybody else joins the sanction, I'm assuming that you agree with me that states oftentimes make choices in interdependent enough environments that the outcome doesn't just depend on their own choice. And that means we almost necessarily have to take a game theoretic approach to understanding how states make these decisions, or other actors within these states make decisions, or non-state actors make decisions. All of these different kinds of actors, individuals, groups, organizations, states, subnational units, corporations, all these different kinds of actors, they oftentimes make their decisions in strategically interdependent environments where the outcome isn't just determined by their own choices. In fact, for anything that's important enough to warrant attention from you and me, students of international relations, things that are worth our time, look how important we are. We're incredibly important. Anything that is worth our time is probably worth 2 or more rational decision makers' time, which is to say, game theory is almost all around us when we look hard enough. My goal for today is just to give you a sense of the flavor of game theoretic fables. I really don't want to show you too much how to analyze just yet. I just want you to get accustomed to me telling you stories about interdependent decision makers. And so my goal for today is really just to give you a crash course, a very quick tour of all sorts of well-known games that one sees in the international relations literature, particularly in international relations theory. The games I'll be showing you today are easy to internalize. You can write them on the back of an envelope anytime you so need. This is very straightforward. There's going to be a lot of them. And so, it might take you a second or two to appreciate the subtle differences between two different games. But once you have, it's not hard to do that. It just takes a second or two. And so my hope is that today can be a kind of a fun lecture in the sense that you see sort of like we're going to skim through the Book of Fables a little bit. Instead of reading any one fable really hard, I just want to give us a skim. I just want you to get a sense about what this enterprise looks like. If you're a political science major, you probably will have seen at least some of the concepts raised today. You've probably seen some of these things already. You've implicitly probably seen a utility function before or something like that. But you've probably also seen some of the games that we'll be discussing today. And you're like, oh boy, I'm going to know something for once. Oh, don't worry, I'll ruin that. Don't worry. I can ruin anything. And you're like, yes, we noticed. But one thing that I think is really fun to think about is how once we start analyzing games, how these seemingly imperceptible differences in the structure of the games that I'll be showing you today, some of the things I show you today are going to look very similar, and yet once we start analyzing them, we'll take games that prima facie seem very similar, and yet once we've studied them thoroughly, we'll find that they generate wildly different outcomes despite their apparent similarities. And so one thing that's really interesting about seeing the fables and then waiting a week to start analyzing them is like, you're going to have some guesses about how some of these fables go together, and you're going to be right a lot of the time, but you're also going to be wrong in interesting ways, which is the best, because then you'll have an intuition, and then you'll learn why that intuition was actually not such a great intuition. So hopefully this should be a pretty fun one, and I say that to you every time, I know, and I know that I don't always deliver on that promise, but I am feeling very sanguine. I feel very optimistic that this lecture, if ever there was a lecture that I could give you that would be entertaining and interesting and exciting and fun for you, which is a pretty big if. But if there were one, then it would be this one. And you're like, I think your statement is vacuously true. Oh, nice job using week 1 material there, Grasshopper. I'm so proud of you. Let's get to it. In the A block, we're going to just get a basic introduction to what a game is through a simple example of an arms race. Two states are thinking about whether or not to build some nuclear weapons. It doesn't get more IR than that, right? And yet, what's going to wind up happening is there's just going to be a bunch of numbers. But I think that you'll see just from this very introductory fable, which is just a very simple story of two states deciding whether or not to arm themselves, you're going to see a lot of subtleties in that decision. You're going to come to have some appreciation about what strategic interdependence looks like. And perhaps most interestingly from all of the A block, you'll see that this problem of the arms race is actually very similar to an incredibly different seeming phenomenon. We will liken arms races to something incredibly different, and you will agree with me at the end, and maybe you won't, but I feel pretty confident that you will agree with me that the fable that we liken the arms race to is both very different and also very similar. And then having gone through one example in somewhat tedious detail, in the B block I'll give you a quick survey of some of the best known strategic form games, especially those games that are relevant in international relations. You'll see, I haven't quite made up my mind just yet, but it's going to be somewhere between 4 and 6 games. We'll see. But I think that by the end, you might be a little bit blurred because it's going to be a very quick crash course in some of these games. But 1, you'll have heard some interesting stories. 2, you'll be prepared to try to relate those stories to stories from international relations. And 3, I think you'll see a wide variety in storytelling possibilities, even with this very simple framework that we'll be discussing today. And then the C block, I just want to show you something slightly more complicated. And actually, it's not slightly more complicated. It's way more complicated. But it's my class and I get to do what I want. It won't be related to your problem set, but it's a fun way to think about conflict in a political economy way. So the last module about exchange, bargaining, and optimality, I think this is really important, and it's worth digging into bargaining/political economy of violence logic whenever we have a chance to. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what a contest model of war would look like if we're taking the political economy of violence very seriously. So a lot going on today. There's going to be a lot on the screen. There's going to be a lot of stories. There's going to be a lot of me telling you once upon a time sort of things. I hope that that's something that you've gotten some taste for and actually have come to enjoy. I hope that you're prepared to see exactly what game theory is and exactly how to encode the problem of strategic interdependence. I really can't wait to show this stuff to you. Let's get started. So here in the A block, I want to introduce you to your first game in this class, and it's going to be a model of an arms race. So the basic idea is pretty straightforward. So suppose we have two countries, let's call them country A and country B. And throughout, if I'm trying to make this internalized, I'll be country A and you can be country B. And we're deciding at the same time whether or not to develop a nuclear weapon. So the basic idea that's going to be underlying this is you don't want to be caught unawares. The very worst thing that can happen if you're a country is you haven't defended yourself and your potential opponent has armed themselves. So it's gonna be a situation where what you don't want to let happen is I armed and you didn't. And what I don't want to let happen is you armed and I didn't. Moreover, we're going to assume that it would be mutually beneficial for us to both not arm, right? So the world would be more secure if among the symmetric outcomes, we both didn't arm instead of we both armed. So these two basic sentences, you don't want to be caught unawares, and among symmetric outcomes, we prefer non-armed to armed. Those two sentences are going to be enough for us to pin down an introductory game of an arms race. So the way we're going to do it is like this. I'm going to equip both countries with an action set. I'm going to give them sets of alternatives to choose between. And in this particular example, we'll equip the two states with the same action set. So country A can do nothing, or they can arm themselves. And country B can do nothing, or they can arm themselves. So they each have an action set. They each have a set of available choices. They both can make a choice. Now, up to this point, that's been what we've defined a utility function on. But actually, what we're going to do in game theory is we're going to take the Cartesian product of these action sets. We're just going to find all the combinations, all the ordered combinations, which we're going to call action profiles. So all of the possible combinations, and then we'll define a utility function on that. You'll see what I mean. So what is the Cartesian product of nothing arm and nothing arm? I've got two binary sets. I need to find the set of all combinations of those sets. You can go back to lecture 1 if you need to, but that's a pretty big if. Remember that the Cartesian product of two sets is just the set of all ordered pairs, where the first element is an element of the first set, and the second part of the ordered pair is an element from the second set. So, for example, let's just specify all of the possible combinations of these two sets. It could be that country A does nothing and country B does nothing. That's nothing, nothing. It could be that country A does nothing and country B arms. Nothing, arm. It could be that country A arms and country B does nothing. That's arm, nothing. And it could be that both countries arm. Arm, arm. So I have 4 combinations of strategies. This is all 4 possible combinations of the strategy sets. Nothing, nothing, nothing arm, arm nothing, and arm arm. I've got 4 combinations. And so each of these, we're going to refer to this as a strategy profile, or an action profile, where it's one action chosen by every player in the game. Now in this 2-player example, we'll have a strategy profile will consist of 2 elements in a vector. Just like these 4. Those are the 4 possible outcomes. The outcomes of this game are those 4 combinations. Notice that if I'm country A and you're country B, right? Then if I decide to arm, there are 2 possible outcomes. The one where I arm and you do nothing, and the one where I arm and you arm. And those seem like very different situations. And not just because of my choice, and not just because of your choice. It's because of the relationship between the choices. It's because the outcome would then be determined by whether or not we are symmetric, or you have a bomb and I don't. It's the interdependence that we're trying to pin down. It's the fact that all 4 of these outcomes are distinct. And they are distinct not just because of the individual choices, but rather because of how the choices aggregate. All right? If you understand that, then a lot of the rest of game theory is going to be details. I mean, really, a lot of this comes down to understanding exactly what that interdependence looks like, because the logic of Nash equilibrium depends on understanding interdependence. The logic of subgame perfection depends on understanding interdependence. All of the informational stuff we'll be discussing, or the repeated stuff that we'll be discussing, every extension, every other variant of this model that we talk about will require some notion of strategic interdependence. And so if you need to pause the video and stare at your navel for an hour until you understand why these 4 different outcomes are distinct, and depend not just on the individual choices, but rather on the combination, then I strongly encourage you to do so. Welcome back. Oh, that's the luxury of college, is you could just go spend an hour thinking about something. And you're like, I don't have an hour. I have to do 10 million things. Yes, I know. But you also have time to stare at your navel. So let's try to assign some utility numbers on these 4 combinations, right? Nothing, 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 arm, nothing, arm. 4 possible endings of the story. Let's figure out what each country thinks about those endings. Let's assign some utilities to this Cartesian product. Okay? Let's think about this from state A's perspective first. This is me. The way this is going to go is I'm going to say that my very favorite outcome is the one where I armed and you didn't. Because now I have a bomb and you don't. This is great. I'm going to be able to exploit you. I'm going to be able to issue credible threats. I'm going to be able to attack you if I need to. I am now in a superior position, so I'm going to give that 4 happiness points. My least favorite outcome is the one where you armed and I didn't. Because now you have a bomb and I don't, and you can issue credible threats to me, or you can attack me, and all the things I was saying with a grin on my face before, now you have a grin on your face. I don't like it when you have a grin on your face. I get 1 happiness point for that outcome. So arm against nothing gives me 4. Nothing against arm gets me 1. So that's our first sentence. You don't want to be caught unawares. The second sentence is that among the symmetric outcomes, we prefer the non-arming ones to the arming ones because that would be more stable and peaceful. So I'll say that the situation where neither of us armed gets me 3 happiness points, and I'll say the situation where we both armed gets me 2 happiness points. Now you see why we were working so hard to do utility functions. Do you think I really want to write out this Cartesian product every time with all of the different squiggly greater than or equal to signs on that? No, I don't want to do that. That sounds awful. So my favorite is arm against nothing. My second favorite is nothing, nothing. My third favorite is arm, arm. And my least favorite is nothing, arm. 4, 3, 2, 1. And the same story is going to work for you. So we're going to say that your favorite outcome is the one where you armed and I did nothing. So nothing, arm gets you 4 happiness points. And arm nothing gets you 1 happiness point because now I've got the gun and I've got the grin on my face and you don't like it when I smile. Then your second favorite outcome is the one where neither of us armed. So you get 3 happiness points for nothing, nothing, and you get 2 happiness points for arm, arm. So 4, 3, 2, 1 for you as well. Without having told you, I have now given you all of the rudiments of a strategic form game, or more generally, just a game. A game consists of 3 things. 1, a set of players. In this case, it's country A and country B. 2, for every actor, for every player, we need an action set. In this case, for country A, it's nothing and arm, and for country B, it's nothing and arm. And then third, for every player, we need a utility function defined on that Cartesian product of all of the action sets. So in this case, it's exactly that utility function that we just worked our way through. This is a game. A game is a set of players. For every player in action, and for every combination of actions, a utility for every player. And that's it. We have just pinned down the strategically interdependent situation of deciding whether or not to arm yourself depending on what you think somebody else might do, where the outcome doesn't just depend on your own actions, where the outcome of a peaceful world, a stable world, or a world that's good for you, or a world that's good for me, or a world full of deterrence where we both armed ourselves, those outcomes depend on far more than just one state's choices. This game encodes the problem of strategic interdependence. Now, you may have seen a strategic form game before, and you might not have seen it aesthetically like this. Right? You might not have seen it in an almost spreadsheet form like this. You might be more familiar with seeing it in a matrix, or fancy speaking, a bimatrix. And so let me show you how we would do that. Let me show you how to write down the arms race game in sort of more compact fashion. And the usual way of writing this is in a matrix, to the point that you sometimes hear these referred to as matrix games, although I don't love that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say that country A is the row player and country B is the column player. So we're essentially going to make a little square that's going to have rows and columns like a chessboard does, ranks and files. And the idea is that I, as state A, will control which row we find ourselves in. And you, as state B, will determine which column we find ourselves in. And then we'll put utility numbers in each of the cells, where like my choice and your choice intersect. You'll see what I mean in a second. So since I'm row player, we'll say that I can choose either to do nothing or to arm. I can do nothing or I can arm, right? It really is just like that. And then your column player, you can either do nothing or you can arm. So I can do nothing or arm, you can do nothing or arm. Notice that the 4 combinations can now be characterized in the square that we just kind of created there, where the action profile where you did nothing and I did nothing is this top left one. The action profile where I did nothing and you armed is this top right one. The action profile where I armed and you didn't arm is this bottom left one. And the action profile where both of us armed is this bottom right one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I want to transport the utility numbers that we talked our way through in that sort of spreadsheet form. I want to transport them into this matrix. Let's start with country A, me, the row player. So you'll remember that my favorite outcome is the one where I armed and you didn't arm. This bottom left one. That's my very favorite outcome. I like it when I have a bomb and you don't. So that gets me 4 happiness points. I'll put it there. My second favorite outcome is the one where I didn't arm and you didn't arm. That gets me 3 happiness points. So at nothing, I'll put a 3 for me. My third favorite outcome is the one where we both armed. That's this bottom right one. And so down here where I didn't arm and you didn't arm, down in this bottom right one, we'll put a 2. And then my least favorite outcome is the one where I didn't arm and you armed. And so at this top right one, we'll put a 1. So 4, 3, 2, 1. Now let's work through you, the column player, country B. Your favorite outcome is the one where you armed and I didn't. So that's nothing, arm. Nothing, arm. So at this top right one, I'll put a 4 for you. The convention is to put row player's number first, column player number second. I'll try to use color to convey that, with apologies in case anybody can't really detect that. I'll try to use color to denote that. However, just try to remember that convention. Row player is comparing the first numbers across rows. Column player is comparing the second number across columns. There's an excellent chance that you're going to mix that up several times, especially as we first get started. And there's an excellent chance that if you do that, you're going to scold yourself for being stupid. Don't do that. It's a stupid convention that we had to develop in order to make a matrix representation of this. This is just how it goes. I'm telling you the convention. You're going to forget it several times. That doesn't make you stupid. It just makes it a convention. It takes time to learn these things. It's okay. Your second favorite outcome is the one where neither of us armed, which is this top left one. So now you put a 3 there. So you could compare this 4 against this 3. You see how you're going to compare across columns. You're going to compare the second number across columns. Your third favorite outcome is the one where we both armed, which is this bottom right one. And so I'll put a 2 there for you. And then your least favorite outcome is the one where I armed and you didn't. So that's this bottom left one. And so I'll put a 1 there for you. So 4, 3, 2, 1. I should note also that there are many versions of a class like this one where what you see on the screen would be the first hour of the first day. And you're like, yes, that's what I was expecting. It's plausible. That's a very common way to teach a class like this, is just to throw up a game on the screen and start to say what a game is, and then try to explain what rationality is. Try to explain what agency over decision making is. Try to understand what aggregated rationality is. Try to understand what Pareto optimality is. Do all that after the fact. Start with a game and then do all the interpretation. But I think that this matrix means more to you now that you've slogged through some of those very foundational matters. This game means so much more because you're used to modeling. This game means more because it doesn't look so trivial, even though it's incredibly trivial. Because this matrix is just the crystallization of a much bigger story. So this is the matrix representation of a strategic form game. This is just a nice compact way of showing you all of the details, everything you need and nothing you don't, about a simple game that involves 2 players who happen to have binary choices, right? So this is a nice simple characterization of a game. Not every game has a matrix representation, but for simple games like the one we've described up to this point, it's very straightforward to construct a matrix just like this. So this is our arms race game. I'd like to tell you another story. Once upon a time, you and I were thieves together. And we got caught doing some thieving. We got caught red-handed. So we get caught, and they put us into separate interrogation chambers. The authorities put you and me in separate interrogation chambers so that neither of us knows what the other is doing. We're going to have to make a simultaneous choice. Neither of us is going to be able to see what the other one did. So they give us two alternatives. They're like, you can either tattle on the other thief. You can either spill the beans and let us know, confess to everything you've done, or you can remain silent. And they say to us, this is how it's going to go. If you tattle, if you give us information that's incriminating about your partner, then we'll let you go free and we'll put your partner in jail for the rest of their life. Right? So if I tattle on you, then you go to and you don't do anything, then you go to jail for the rest of your life, and I get to go home free. That's great. If not, I know that if neither of us tattles, I happen to know that if neither of us tattles, they can only nail us for a misdemeanor. They don't have enough to put us away for a long time. Right? So if we both remain silent, then we'll just have to pay a fine. And if we both tattle, then we'll both go to jail for a long amount of time, less than a misdemeanor, but more than the rest of our lives. So the basic idea here is that my favorite situation is the one where I tattle and you remain silent, and vice versa. Your favorite situation is the one where you tattle and I remain silent. That sounds an awful lot like the first sentence from the arms race. And second of all, among the symmetric outcomes, we prefer the one where we cooperate versus the one where we don't. So in other words, I can try to put this story that I just told you into a matrix. So suppose that I'm role player. I can either remain silent or I can tattle on you. And you're column player. You can either remain silent or you can tattle on me. Let me fill in the story that I just told you in terms of this matrix. My favorite outcome, role player's favorite outcome, is the one where role player tattles and column player remains silent. I'll put a 4 there. Role player's second favorite alternative is the one where nobody tattles. Role player's third favorite alternative is the one where both tattle. And role player's least favorite alternative is the one where role player stays silent and column player tattles. How about you? You're column player. Well, your favorite outcome is the one where I remain silent and you tattle. That's up here. Your second favorite outcome is the one where neither of us tattles. That's right here. Your third favorite outcome is the one where we both tattle. That's right here. And your least favorite outcome is the one where I tattle and you remain silent. That's right here. So this is a very well-known game. You know this game. This game is called The Prisoner's Dilemma. This is a very famous game. This is probably, if you've heard of a game, which is an if, but if you've heard of a game, you've probably heard of this game. This is one of the most famous games out there. But notice something with me now. So this is a very famous game, but notice something with me. So here we are. We're at The Prisoner's Dilemma. Let's go back to the arms race. Wait a second. Go back to The Prisoner's Dilemma. Are you noticing anything? Go back to the arms race. Wait a second. Go back to the prisoner's dilemma. Arms race. Prisoner's dilemma? I feel like I'm at the eye doctor now. Camera 2. You notice anything? They're the same game. They're the same exact game. The arms race is the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma model, the fable of two thieves who are in separate interrogation chambers trying to figure out the best way to tattle or not tattle on one another, is similar, is relatable, is modelable akin to two countries deciding whether or not to start a nuclear program, deciding whether or not to have a nuclear bomb. These two incredibly different narratives generate incentive structures that are identical to one another in their underlying structures. The prisoner's dilemma is a nice way to think about a lot of different things, not just prisoners. The prisoner's dilemma is about way more than just prisoners. In fact, it's probably not about prisoners at all. It's about how to think about interdependent actions when somebody can either cooperate or defect, and where there's a particularly perverse incentive structure. And that incentive structure can either appear inorganically, like there's some nasty authority that put us in two separate interrogation chambers and therefore designed a system that made us feel that way, or the structure of international anarchy and the arming decisions underneath anarchy forced us to engage in behavior even though no malevolent authority put us in two separate interrogation chambers, even though we're just trying to make the best decisions that we can for ourselves as states under anarchy. So the incentive structure can be imposed, or it can be evolutionary, That's not what makes a game a game. What makes a game is the underlying incentives and the interdependent structure that the players experience with one another. So the prisoner's dilemma, the arms race, there's a lot of other phenomena that have been likened to the prisoner's dilemma. It's a conveniently memorable story. It's a conveniently memorable fable. So the prisoner's dilemma is sort of like a central hub. A lot of different things can be related to the prisoner's dilemma, and any two things that can be related to the prisoner's dilemma are therefore similar because they share at least somewhat similar DNA, strategic DNA, interdependent DNA. The prisoner's dilemma has similar DNA to the arms race, and they both have similar DNA to two firms deciding whether or not to engage in emissions reductions. There's a million things that are prisoner's dilemmata. They're all very similar. They're all distinct as well. That's what's beautiful about this, is we can take seemingly different things and show that they're somewhat the same. That's the joy of modeling. That's my new cookbook. So now that we've pinned down the most canonical strategic form game and also shown you one substantive cousin, let's talk about more of them. Let's just go through a recipe book and figure out all the different things that we can try to liken things to. We'll talk about all of those over in the B block. So here in the B block, I want to show you more games. I want to show you 4 families of games. I'll show you 6 games total, but some of them are close cousins with one another. So we'll talk about 4 main kinds of games. These are sort of well-known games as well. They all have well-known names, maybe not as famous as The Prisoner's Dilemma, but they're similarly named and similarly well-known. They are the sort of things that if an international relations person is talking to another international relations person, these are terms that will come up often. Right? These are games that will come up often. These are very useful fables for international relations. So a favorite game of mine is the coordination game. And the coordination game is super simple and straightforward. And here's the basic idea. I'm a driver and you're a driver. We are 2 drivers. And we need to figure out where to drive on the road. So I'm a driver. We have 2 separate cars. I'm driving someplace, you're driving someplace, but we're on the same road. We're both on University Avenue. And I'm driving east on University Avenue, and you're driving west on University Avenue. For those of you that haven't been to Champaign Urbana yet, University Avenue is a street. I don't want to talk about driving on Green Street because I don't want to talk about Green Street. I want to talk about University Avenue. So here's the idea. I'm going east and you're going west. I can drive on the left side of the road or the right side of the road. I can drive on my left or my right. And you can drive on your left or your right. So we have binary action sets again. I can drive on the left or the right, and you can drive on the left or the right. We're just driving. We need to think this through. So let's just pin that down and let's just make the matrix, right? So I can drive on the left or the right. That's my action set. I can drive on the left or the right. And you can drive on the left or the right. It's just the same. All of these are going to be like 2x2 matrices. It's all going to have the same structure. Now think about this. If I drive on my left and you drive on your left, then that's fine. We haven't crashed into anybody, right? So there's no crashing. There's no crashing. If we both drive on what seems to be the left side of the road to us, then there's no crash. Let's give it 1 happiness point for me and 1 happiness point for you. Similarly, if I drive on the right side of the road and you drive on the right side of the road, then neither of us crashes. That's what happens here in the United States much of the time. Is I drive on the right, you drive on the right. That's the law. And so I get 1 happiness point and you get 1 happiness point. 1-1, 1-1. However, let's think about off the diagonal. So if I'm going east on University and I'm driving on the left side of the road and you're going west on University and you're driving on your right side of the road, that's the same lane. That's the same lane. That's the same lane. That's bad. That's really bad. Fiery car crash. Let's give that 0 happiness points. 0 happiness points for me, 0 happiness points for you. Aren't you glad we did utility theory week so that you can like just talk about happiness points now instead of like all those squigglies? All those arrows? No. We don't want to do that. Happiness points are so great. They make me very happy. How happy? 2. Similarly, if I drive on the right side of the road, what seems to be my right side of the road, and you drive on what seems to be your left side of the road, we're in the same lane, we crash. 0 happiness points for us both. This is called the coordination game. Why is it called the coordination game? Because we would like to coordinate. If we both go on the left, that's great. If we both go on the right, that's great. Otherwise, not so great. This is one of my very favorite games. We're going to talk about this game quite a bit next week. And you're like, how could this be one of your favorite games? Because think about all of the different times that you would like to coordinate with somebody, where everybody would do better if people would just kind of figure out which way to go, and then they all coordinated, right? Anytime you and your friends are trying to figure out where to go to lunch, you have a coordination problem. Anytime a bunch of allies are trying to figure out how to set a monetary policy, they have a coordination problem. You figuring out Chipotle versus Potbelly, and the Federal Reserve Chair figuring out hawkish versus dovish monetary policy is the same sort of thing, in the sense that they both improve. Both you and the Fed Reserve Chair do better if you can coordinate with other relevant actors. However, the easiest way to relay the story to you is to talk about driving. This is not a model of driving. The prisoner's dilemma is not a model of prisoners. This is just a convenient way to summarize the information of two decision makers would both benefit if they could coordinate and would both do worse if they didn't. That's what we're trying to pin down here. Now, there's actually a multitude of coordination games. This is the main coordination game. This is the capital C coordination game. However, there's a close cousin that's also worth mentioning and has a different story. Suppose that you and I are two fans of the arts. It's a big assumption, but let's just go with it. And suppose that we're here in Champaign-Urbana, beautiful Champaign-Urbana, just dripping with the art scene. And it turns out that in Champaign-Urbana, there are two great concert halls. Just assume there are two great concert halls in Champaign-Urbana. And at the Champaign Concert Hall, tonight they will be showing a concert of Bach music by Johann Sebastian Bach. Sadly, not Johann Sebastian Chewbacca, who was a much cooler entity. That isn't true. I love Chewie to death, but he's not as cool as Johann Sebastian Bach. However, here in Urbana, where we're a lot edgier, nothing says edgy quite like a NASA t-shirt, we're way edgier here, and we'll be showing a concert by Igor Stravinsky. This game is going to be called Bach or Stravinsky. The idea goes like this. We both want to go to a concert tonight, and we would prefer to be at the same concert. We want to coordinate because we're musical companions. You and I are two musical companions who hate to listen to music together, no matter how much we happen to like the music. It just isn't the same with our musical companion not there. Bach means nothing to me without you there. There isn't an amount of counterpoint in the world that could make me give a shit about listening to Bach without you there by my side. And similarly for you, there's no amount of weird polyrhythm that could happen in a Stravinsky show that would make you want to get without me by your side. There's no accounting for taste.
We're musical companions.
So we're two musical companions, and we're simultaneously figuring out. We don't have cell phones because we're the sort of people that go to classical concerts. So we don't have cell phones, we can't text. All we have to do is drive to a show at the same time. And here's the problem. I like Bach, and you like Stravinsky. We both like listening together, but we have different preferences over which together. So here's the idea. I can go to Bach or Stravinsky. And you can go to Bach or Stravinsky. If we both go to Bach, if we're at the action profile Bach, then I get 2 happiness points and you only get 1 happiness point. If we both go to Stravinsky, then I only get 1 happiness point and you get 2 happiness points. So essentially, this is a coordination game sort of story, but where there's an extra bump if we go to your preferred composer's concert. I prefer Bach, you prefer Stravinsky. And for the other 2 profiles where we haven't gone to the same show, we're crestfallen, we're heartbroken, we might as well be deaf without our musical companion by our side. 0, 0, 0, 0. Look, here's Bach or Stravinsky, here's the coordination game. They are similar but not the same. They have the same structure in the sense that we both want to be on this diagonal and we don't want to be on this diagonal. So they're similar in that regard, but they're different in that Bach or Stravinsky allows us to model the potentially pernicious effects of heterogeneous preferences over the collaborative outcomes. So maybe you and your friend are trying to figure out where to have lunch together, and you prefer to eat together than apart. But that doesn't mean you don't have to like the same food. If one of you is a vegetarian and one of you is not, then right? Now we have a Bach or Stravinsky problem on our hands. So these two games are two important exemplars of a class of games you might call coordination games, where the capital C coordination game is like the lead single. So these are games where there's some incentive for actors who are making their decisions by themselves. There's some incentive for them to try to land at the same place. Let me juxtapose coordination games with an important game of anti-coordination called matching pennies. So here's the situation. Suppose that I have a penny and you have a penny. We have two pennies. And you're like, I thought we already did that lecture. We did, but this is way cooler. No, it isn't. That was a good lecture. Right now, I can tell you right now, I'm not doing as well in this lecture as I was during the Pareto lecture. So I have a penny and you have a penny, and we're playing the following game. We have a penny. We keep our pennies hidden. And I can put my penny heads up or tails up. And you can put your penny heads up or tails up. And then after we've done our respective clandestine flipping of the coin, we say, okay, time's up. And here's the idea. If they're both heads or they're both tails, if they're the same, then I get to keep the two coins. And if they're different, if it's heads, tails, or tails, heads, then you get to keep the two coins. So I want it to be the same. I want heads, heads, or tails, tails. And you want them to be different. You want tails, heads, or heads, tails. So this is a game called Matching Pennies. That's the name of that particular little contest that people... Nowadays, you'd need a $5 bill for it to be interesting, and that's not as much fun to put heads or tails up. What do you call the front and back of a bill? Is it heads and tails? Front and back? What do you call the front and back of a bill? I don't know that. I should know that. And you should too. Why haven't you told me? Obverse and reverse, according to Wikipedia. Obverse and reverse. That sounds so much fancier. So I'm gonna put heads or tails up. So I have two strategies. I can go heads or tails, and you can go heads or tails. At heads, I get 1 and you get -1. Because at heads, I get to take your coin. At tails, I get 1 and you get -1. Because I get to take your coin. At heads, tails, though, I get -1 and you get 1 because you get to take my coin. And at tails, heads, I get -1 and you get 1 because you get to take my coin. So it's 1 -1, 1 -1, -1, 1, -1, 1. This is the game of matching pennies. Sometimes you see this referred to as a game of anti-coordination, where one player wants to coordinate and the other one doesn't. We've all been there before. Just wait till wedding season. You'll know what I mean. So those are two very different strategic situations. Coordination and anti-coordination are very different. In one, there's aligned interests, and in one, there's very competing interests. So in order for me to show you that, let's talk about where coordination and anti-coordination show up in a utility imputation space, like we've talked about in the problem sets. So notice with me, let's put row player's utility on this axis, and let's put column player's utility on this axis. And I'm going to draw coordination. I'll draw a Bach or Stravinsky just to make this more interesting. All right. So in Bach or Stravinsky, so there are 3 utility imputations that one gets out of Bach or Stravinsky. Right? There's one where I have 2 happiness points and you have 1 happiness point. That's the Bach. There's one where you have 2 happiness points and I have 1 happiness point. That's the Stravinsky. And then both of the ones where we missed each other, those are down at 0-0. That's Bach Stravinsky and Stravinsky Bach. Notice that both Bach and Stravinsky Pareto dominate Bach, Stravinsky, and Stravinsky Bach. So there are some Pareto optimal outcomes. We have a Pareto frontier of coordination, and the outcomes where we have coordinated, Pareto dominate those where we have not. However, Bach or Stravinsky induces a bit of a bargaining problem because we have an incentive to coordinate, but we have competing interests over the coordinated outcomes. And really, how much you turn that up. So in the coordination game, right, they were both 1-1. There was a single Pareto optimal outcome, or they were identical in terms of the utility imputations. So there were 2 Pareto optimal outcomes that generated the same utility imputation 1-1, if we both drove on the left or we both drove on the right. And so essentially, what happens in this family of coordination games is as I turn up the intensity of preferences for your preferred outcome, we wind up with a wider and wider and wider bargaining range. So as I turn up how much I like Bach and how much you like Stravinsky versus how much you just like hanging out with me and you're like, that's not very much, shut up. I can just sort of make this, but no matter what, there's a Pareto frontier. All of these coordination games involve a disagreement point of failing to coordinate, and then some Pareto frontier depending on the variety of preferences. Now let's think about matching pennies. So in matching pennies, there are two possible utility imputations, 1 minus 1 and minus 1, 1. Does either of those Pareto dominate the other? No. No, they do not. The Pareto frontier there is like the set of all outcomes because it's a zero-sum game. Notice that 1 and minus 1 and 1, they both add to 0. So in anti-coordination, we wind up with a very different structure of the interaction where anything goes. Anything is Pareto efficient, but anything is Pareto efficient. There's no incentive to do anything good. While we're drawing utility imputations, let's just consider what the prisoner's dilemma looked like in this situation. There were 4 distinct utility imputation outcomes. So if I stay silent and you stay silent, that's 3-3. If I tattle and you stay silent, that's 4-1. If I stay silent and you tattle, that's 1-4. And if we both tattle, that's 2-2. Now we've got a Pareto frontier again, right? We've got a 3-element Pareto frontier. We also have a disagreement point of tattle. So these different games are inducing very different underlying structures. And you can see them in matrices, you can see them in utility imputation spaces, you can see them verbally as I tell you the story, you can see a spreadsheet like we did with the initial arms race. All of these are different ways of seeing the same things, the same underlying structure of a story. Let me show you another well-known game. It's called the Stag Hunt. The Stag Hunt was first described informally by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And the idea goes like this. We are 2 hunters. I'm a hunter, you're a hunter. We are 2 hunters. I'm hunter A and you're hunter B. And here's the idea. I can go hunting for a stag or for a hare. And you can go hunting for a stag or for a hare. And the basic idea is you can get a hare by yourself, but I can only get a stag if you go for a stag with me. In order to get a stag, you need 2 people. It takes 2 hunters to bring down a stag, but only 1 hunter to get a hare. So there's an underlying cooperation thing going on. It would be better if we could coordinate on going for the stag, but your outside option is a little bit better because if you go off for a hare by yourself, you're going to do okay. So here I am, I'm role player. I can go hunting for stag, I can go hunting for hare. And there you are, you're column player. You can go hunting for stag or you can go hunting for hare. H-A-R-E, you jerk. H-A-R-E. Yes, I know I'm hunting for H-A-I-R too, you jerk. So the numbers go like this. If we both hunt for a stag, if I go for stag and you go for stag, then we get the stag. We get to split the stag and I get 2 happiness points and you get 2 happiness points. But suppose that I go for a stag and you go for a hare. Now I got nothing because I went after a stag and I didn't have my home slice with me. I thought we were hunting companions, but we weren't. So I'm crestfallen here. I get 0 happiness points because I didn't get a stag. You got a hare though. And I'm going to give you 1 happiness point for that because you can catch a hare by yourself. So that's 0-1. Likewise, if I go for a hare and you go for a stag, then you swing and miss. That's 0 happiness points for you. And I get a hare, that's 1 happiness point for me. And if we both go for a hare, then we both catch a hare. There's lots of hares in the world. They breed like rabbits. And so that's 1-1. So 2-2, 1-1, and then 1-0 and 0-1. What does that look like in utility imputation space? Well, if we both go for a stag, that gives us a 2-2. If we both go for a hare, that gives us a 1-1. 2-2 Pareto dominates 1-1. And 1-1 Pareto dominates both 0-1 and 1-0. So that's a very different looking utility imputation space. There's a very different underlying structure to this story. This story is about, can we manage to get that bonus by working together, or do we have to relegate ourselves to something pretty good? But here, the idea is, it's possible for us to both do okay, but then if we manage to coordinate, we go from pretty good to really good. So the Stag Hunt is very useful for countries that are trying to cooperate with one another, but have incentive to peel off under international anarchy. This is useful for alliance structures, for example. Maybe you're strong enough to do okay by yourself, but it will be even better if we can manage to do well together. There's a game related to Stag Hunt that comes up pretty often in international relations literature called the assurance game. So the assurance game sort of has a similar flavor to the prisoner's dilemma in terms of you can do something cooperative or you can do something defecty. So let's say that I'm a country and you're a country. I'm country A, you're country B. We are two countries. And I can either I can do something cooperative or I can defect. And you can do something cooperative or you can defect. Stag or hare. The very best outcome is if we both cooperate. That gets us 4-4. If I cooperate and you cooperate, then I get 4 happiness points and you get 4 happiness points. My second favorite outcome is the one where I defected and you cooperated. That gets me 3 and gets you 1. Similarly, if I cooperate and you defect, then that gets me 1 and you 3. And if we both defect, then it's 2-2. So this sort of is like a relative to both Prisoner's Dilemma and to the Stag Hunt. This sort of lives halfway in between. Because if I draw the utility imputation space there, we see similarities to both Prisoner's Dilemma and a Stag Hunt. So the assurance utility imputation space is similar to the Stag Hunts in the sense that there is a unique Pareto optimal outcome where we both cooperate. However, the shape of the structure is similar to the Prisoner's Dilemma in the sense that there's a little bit more of a triangular sort of structure where we both might want to defect on the other. So now you've seen Prisoner's Dilemma, coordination, Bach or Stravinsky, matching pennies, Stag Hunt, and assurance. That's a lot of games already, and I hope by now you're starting to get a little more comfortable with the structure. I'm moving a little bit faster as we go here because I hope that you're getting more comfortable with the idea of utility numbers being assigned to combinations of choices. What I do plus what you do generates an outcome that then the utility numbers are experienced over. Let me talk about one more game. This is a very well-known game, useful in international relations. It's called Chicken. So Chicken is, the idea of Chicken is based on the movie Rebel Without a Cause, 1950s movie. There's something called a chickie run in there that I think that people didn't think they could get published in scholarly journals if they typed chickie run, and so they just call it Chicken because that's just way more scholarly sounding. So the idea of Chicken goes like this. We're two adolescent youths, full of hormones and trying to show how awesome we are. You can tell by my blasé attitude how I'm feeling about this. You, on the other hand, might think this is a pretty neat way to make decisions, in which case, let's have a long talk sometime. So, I'm in a car and you're in a car, and the idea of Chicken is the following. We start driving our cars toward one another at very high speed. So I'm driving real fast, this is my hand and this is you. This is me and this is you. So I'm driving real fast and you're driving real fast and we're driving toward one another. We're trying to show who's more awesome. We're trying to figure out which of us is the more awesome. Okay? And so the idea is we're driving toward one another in cars at very high speed. And whichever one of us swerves first loses. Right? So we're driving real fast. And so if I swerve, then you win and I lose because I'm the chicken. I look like a chicken and you look pretty awesome. Everybody thinks you're awesome. Everybody thinks I'm a chicken. You're like, we didn't need cars for that. Shut up. So think about the 4 possibilities, right? It could be that we're driving and I swerve first and you win. Now you look awesome and I look like an idiot. Vice versa, it could be that you swerve and I go straight. Now I'm awesome and you look like an idiot. It could be that we both swerve, in which case it's like a tie. We both kind of look like idiots, not as much as if we lost, and it's not as awesome as if we had won. And then there's the 4th option where neither one of us swerved and then... So I'm a driver, you're a driver. We are 2 drivers. I am the road driver, you are the column driver. And I can swerve or I can go straight. And you can swerve or you can go straight. If we both swerve, then it's a tie. And hopefully we decide not to do this again and we'll get 1 happiness point apiece. If I swerve and you go straight, then you win and I lose. And you get 2 happiness points for winning and I get 0 happiness points for being the chicken. Similarly, if I go straight and you swerve, then I win and you lose. I get 2 happiness points and you get 0 happiness points because you're the chicken. However, if we both are burned chickens, I guess burned non-chickens in that case, neither of us was a chicken, that's great, but now we're dead. Less great. So that's -1 happiness points. The scale doesn't matter. I tried to say this over and over in the class, and the scale doesn't matter. That could be negative Google, it could be negative infinity, it doesn't matter. It just has to be less than 0, which is the next lowest number. -1 happiness points. So 1, 1, 0, 2, 2, 0, -1, -1. That's Chicken. It's a model of brinkmanship. If 2, superpowers are trying to demonstrate which one of them is more awesome, by not backing down during crisis bargaining. If, I don't know, hypothetically, if one of the superpowers decided to put nuclear weapons on an island close to the other superpower, hypothetically, let's just be even less hypothetical. Let's say it was the Soviet Union decided to put missiles on Cuba, or the United States decided to put missiles in Turkey. And we're trying to figure out who's going to back down, and I'm going to say, I'm going to make you swerve because I'm just going to keep driving at you. I'm just going to keep driving at you. I'm going to make you swerve. 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 Oh crap, no, I swerve. So chicken is very well known in models of brinkmanship, particularly it was used for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now think of all the different stories that we've talked about. We've talked about stories where the players want to go together. We've talked about ones where they don't want to go together. We've talked about ones where they find themselves in very odd situations because they're driving toward one another with nuclear bombs apparently on their cars. We've talked about, do they want to cooperate and then do some extra cooperation like hunting for a stag together? There's all sorts of different things that countries might want to do while they interact with one another. And many of those things are highly relatable to these nice compact fables, these nice narratives, these nice matrices, these nice utility imputation spaces, these nice crystallizations of the important strategically interdependent scenarios that states or other actors oftentimes find themselves under. Situations where it isn't just about my choice, it isn't just about your choice, it's about how our choices relate to one another. This is what a game is. And these are all emblematic pieces of the theory of games. So this is sort of where we're going to be living from now on. We'll be taking this setup and modifying it in ways that you can't even imagine. But this is the core basic idea. Two actors, each faced with a binary choice. That's not that far from where we're going to be headed. If you can see what's going on inside these matrices, if you can tell me why the numbers find themselves to where they are, then you're off to a great start. Now, just to get you thinking about different possibilities, maybe somewhat more complicated spaces, I want to show you one more cool model over in the C block. See you there. So here in the C block, I want to talk about a contest model of violence. So the idea is similar in the sense where I'm going to be making a choice about how much to arm myself, and you're going to be making a choice about how much to arm yourself. But the idea is we'll be choosing from somewhat more complicated spaces. I'll be choosing an armament level out of the real numbers, and you'll be choosing an armament level out of the real numbers. So we're going to fight a war. And the idea here is that I don't want the war to be determined. I don't want the outcome of the war to be determined by some exogenous lottery like we had before. So in the bargaining model of war that we discussed up to this point, we've had the probability that one country beats the other is P, and that P is just given to you. Maybe it's a half, maybe it's 3/5, maybe it's 1/4, whatever. That probability is given to you at the beginning of the model. That lives outside of the model. But I don't know if you noticed, but who wins a war depends not just on like these outside factors, but also on how hard the countries choose to fight. So how do you decide, if you're a country, how hard to fight when you find yourself in a nasty situation like a violent conflict? So that's what I want to talk about. So I'm going to pin this down with a strategic form game, but it's not going to be one I can put into a matrix. We won't have matrices anymore. It's just going to be a story. So I'm a country and you're a country. We are two countries. I'm country A and you're country B. We find ourselves in a situation where we're going to fight. So I'm going to choose an effort level, E sub A. My effort level is just going to be some number greater than or equal to 0. Maybe I don't fight at all. Maybe I fight at 1 unit of vigor. Maybe I fight at 5 units of vigor. Maybe I fight at pi, some irrational number, units of vigor. But I choose some effort level. How many people, how many soldiers am I going to send to the battlefield? How much of my industry am I going to dedicate to arming? Well, I'm making some choice about how hard to fight. And that all comes into an effort level, E sub A. And you make a similar choice. You choose E sub B. That's your effort level. You choose some number that's greater than or equal to 0. Maybe you don't fight at all. Maybe you fight at Google units of happiness, of vigor. Now I've got my happiness confused with how hard I'm fighting. It's all very confusing. So I choose an effort level. You choose an effort level. We both choose an effort level. That's our actions. So instead of choosing straight or swerve. Instead of choosing cooperate defect, tattle silent, now I choose one effort level out of an infinite continuum of potential effort levels. The thing is, fighting also makes the cost of war go up. As I fight harder, my chance of winning goes up, but the costs go up too because I'm investing more into fighting. Right? I'm wasting more lives. I'm salting more fields. I'm doing more nasty things. So there's going to be a benefit to fighting harder, but there's also going to be a cost to fighting harder. So we've got two players, country A and country B. We've got two action sets, the non-negative reals. And so all that's left is to specify some utilities. We need utilities over all of the possible combinations. I need a function that tells me how happy I am in expectation based on how hard I fight and how hard you fight. So the thing that I want to show you that's super fun is called a contest success function. And you're like, that doesn't sound that fun. Shut up, it's really fun. So what this is it's a device that takes my effort level and your effort level, and it spits out the probability that I win the fight. So how hard I fight and how hard you fight are going to determine the P. P is a function of how hard we both fought. That's pretty cool already, right? So I'm going to choose a very simple contest success function. Let's say that the contest success function, so long as one of us expends some effort, so long as EA plus EB isn't 0, let's say that the probability that I win is EA over EA plus EB. Notice with me that this is a probability. It is greater than or equal to 0 because the numerator is greater than or equal to 0 and the denominator is strictly greater than 0. And it's less than or equal to 1 because EB is greater than or equal to 0, so the denominator must be at least as high as the numerator. So it can't be greater than 1 and it can't be less than 0. This is a probability. This function read in my effort level and your effort level, and it spit out what's the probability that I beat you in the fight, depending on how hard we both fought. So with probability EA over EA plus EB, I win. And let's say that the prize is worth V. Let's just say it's worth of some value. It could be 1, it could be something greater than that, it could be something less. Some strictly positive boon for winning. And with complementary probability, with probability EB over EA plus EB, I lose and I get 0 happiness points. Regardless, I must pay a cost. And let's just say that's EA plus EB. I have to subtract away how hard I fought. So in other words, there's a benefit to fighting in the sense that it gives me a higher chance of winning this prize, which is worth V dollars. But there's a downside to fighting in the sense that every additional little calorie that I burn while fighting is lost. There's a cost. And the same for you. Your probability of winning is EB over EA plus EB. And if you win, then you get all V units of happiness. And if you lose, then you get 0. And you pay the same costs. So this is a game. This is a game. We have a set of players, country A and country B. We have a strategy space for each of them. And we have a utility function over all possible combinations of those strategies. Let me just show you how you might modify this a little bit. Suppose that I had more technology than you did. Suppose that I had better weapons available. What does that mean? Technology of violence. I have better technology of violence. That's a provocative set of words, isn't it? What that means is I'm better at turning effort into victory. If I have more technology than you do, then the same amount of effort by me generates more enhanced odds of winning. I'm better at turning my effort into victory than you are if I have more technology. If we measure effort in terms of like soldier hours, then a soldier hour spent by a soldier holding a bazooka is different than a soldier hour spent with a soldier holding a stick. The technology converts the soldier hours into violent potentialities. How would I model that? Well, I could amend my contest success function a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'll say that there's some term lambda that's greater than 1, right? It's strictly greater than 1. And I'm going to multiply my effort level by that. And so what happens is that makes my probability of victory go up faster than yours. It means if I fight a little bit, if lambda is really big, if I have a lot of technology, then it doesn't take a whole lot of effort for me to have a very high chance of winning. This is how you would include technology into a model of the battlefield. This is a completely different game now. It's the same structure of game, but now we parameterize technology in it. We've included some new term. Maybe technology really matters in terms of who wins and who loses, and the subsequent decision to fight in the first place. Maybe technology throws all that off. Conversely, if you had better technology, then my lambda would be less than 1. You would be better at converting technology, and how far lambda is between 0 and 1, how much closer it is to 0 than 1, would pin down how much higher tech you have than me. So essentially that lambda was there all along. It was just lambda equals 1, which means that we have the same technology. So you can write down the model as a special case where we had the same tech. Or if you wanted to, you can say, well, there's a huge technological difference between these two belligerents. Which is the right way to go depends on what you're trying to pin down. Two superpowers, they're probably balanced. Asymmetric conflict, they're not balanced. Guerrilla warfare, they're not balanced. I could have modeled the contest a little bit differently another way. The battlefield, sometimes the battlefield really rewarded who had the bigger force, and sometimes it was way more random. So I like to think about this in terms of football. So if I have a way better football team than you do, and we're playing a football game together, but suppose it's raining real hard. The ball gets slick and wet, and the ground is really slick and wet, and everybody slips all the time. It's almost impossible to score. The only thing that really helps you, if you're playing a football game in torrential downpour, then really only random dumb luck that happens determines whether or not you're going to score, because there's no way to do well when it's that wet. So no matter which of us has the better team, it's going to come down to something random. So suppose that I had this exponent and I took every effort level up to that exponent. I'll put an alpha there. And this alpha tells us how much the battlefield rewards the better team, the bigger force. So if alpha is 1, as it had been before, then whichever team has the better force gets a proportional benefit for that. But if alpha is 0, then no matter what you take your effort level to, anything to the 0th power is 1. And no matter what my effort level is, anything to the 0th power is 1. And so we wind up with 1 over 1 plus 1 is 1/2. So I could modify this model to allow for technological differences, or I could change this model to talk about randomness on the battlefield. Which battlefields are more responsive to superior forces? A smaller force might want to take their fight to a different battlefield where they have a better chance of winning. Maybe a guerrilla force would rather fight in the hills or the forests where randomness might matter more, rather than find themselves on some big flat battlefield where the superior force with artillery is going to be able to take over. So if I'm trying to choose a battlefield, one thing I care about is how much randomness does it induce. If I'm the superior force, I don't want randomness. And if I'm the smaller force, I want randomness. So with two stupid little terms, a lambda and an alpha, I took this initial contest model of war, which is a nice way about thinking about the marginal costs and the marginal benefits of additional investment in violence. And I took that and I added two really important things. What's the situation on the battlefield, and which of us has better technology? With two numbers and a cleverly constructed function. So I'm showing you this. I'm trying to jam on this a little bit because I want you to see that this is fun. And you're like, yes, nothing says that this is fun quite as much as you telling me, hey, this is fun. You are enjoying this right now. But this is just a canvas. If there's something that you think matters in a particular fight, you could add it. If there's something you think doesn't matter, you could get rid of it. There's all sorts of different ways to play around with these models, but that's modeling. What a game is just the set of players, just the set of action sets. Those remained unchanged over all the things I've discussed with you so far. And then some utility function, which is just an opportunity to tweak and play around with all these fun ideas. Combine these fun ideas in interesting and idiosyncratic ways, trying to pin down what's the right fable for any given story. So that's pretty cool, right? This contest model of war, this is one of my very favorite ways to think about this. This is a really neat way to pin down effort levels, marginal benefit, like the technology of fighting, the marginal costs of fighting, who's good at minimizing their marginal costs, who can militarize cheaply, which battlefields are we going to choose to fight on. All of this in one stupid equation that I can show you in 5 minutes. That's the fun of this. That's the creativity in all of this. It's not just math. It's not. I mean, I know that it's difficult to see this beyond the symbols, but the symbols are just my way of trying to tell you a cool story. So we'll revisit this contest model a few more times. We're not going to be able to analyze it because analyzing it requires calculus, and I'm not going to ask calculus of you, but every now and again I might say, and I'll do some magic fairy dust and solve this model for you. But models like this exist where we're making a somewhat more subtle choice. We're choosing some effort level rather than making a binary attack, not attack, arm, not arm, silent, tattle. Maybe I have a much more subtle choice to make. The subtlety of that choice then enables me to do all sorts of really fun things from a modeling standpoint. So you might never write down a model, but seeing these creative things happen, even if you never write down a model, I hope that you start to see that it's fun to tell stories this way. So what did we talk about today? Well, we talked about games. This is a class about strategic, rationalist, international relations. I'm trying to give you an introductory tour of a lot of that. And game theory lies at the heart of most of that enterprise. Game theory models where multiple actors make choices, and then their choices combine to generate outcomes in these strategically independent ways. Game theory is a workhorse tool in international relations and throughout the social sciences precisely because it enables us to think about interdependence in these very particularly explicit ways. So there was interdependence in a market model. There was interdependence in social choice theory. There's been interdependence when we think about Pareto optimality. But we haven't modeled the act of choosing under interdependence as explicitly as what we just talked about today. And throughout the rest of the class, we're going to take this basic setup of a set of players, for every player some action set, and for every player some utility function defined over the product of the action sets. We're going to take that basic setup and we're going to extend it and modify it and tweak it in myriad ways. But if you can understand this core tension, this core idea of modeling strategic interdependence this way, then the rest should fall into place pretty easily. Because the core tension in all of this is just, how do I make my choices when I am not the sole determiner of what happens to me? And I'd like to think that some of the things that I've shown you today and the way that I've shown them to you have whet your appetite in the sense that we can think about a particularly interesting set of stories, a particularly interesting set of narratives through this game theoretic lens. So there's all sorts of fables out there. There's all sorts of interesting stories with tensions and strategic interdependence. And it's really fun to try to think about the proper way to encode them. What are the proper crystallizations of these stories once we distill them down to their interdependent core? And in fact, it's with this idea of narratives fresh in mind that I'd like to conclude with a provocative thought. Insofar as I know anything about mathematical modeling in the social sciences and the associated philosophy of science, it seems to me that there are two main schools of thought about how to look at models in the social sciences from a philosophical perspective. In broad brushstrokes, you can think about these as scientific realists and scientific instrumentalists. Scientific realists tend to be of the belief that the world is out there, it exists, and it's our job to measure it and try to explain what is happening with it through what wind up being sometimes called covering laws in this measurable, relatable way. So if I say to you that I think that smoking causes cancer and therefore reduces the duration of somebody's life, then it's incumbent upon me to obtain data that works toward that end, and through some statistics, demonstrate that that is true. I must test my theory, I must issue some hypothesis, and then use simple or potentially quite complicated statistics to try to demonstrate why the evidence is on the side of my theory. And for basic public health issues like does smoking reduce the length of somebody's life? That's a very natural way to proceed. We think about all sorts of different mechanisms that we're trying to understand. There's lots of different claims of this form, and it's natural to want to try to measure them. It's not very difficult to think about how to properly measure somebody's life and the length of it. It's not very difficult to think about how to measure how somebody smokes. Similar things happen in the social sciences, so oftentimes in basic introductory macroeconomics, one sees models where the quantities in question, the theoretical concepts, are very much the things that are being measured. I might try to explicitly model GDP as a function of other factors. GDP then is something that, although it's complicated to measure, it is something that is philosophically measurable. And so a core focus from the scientific realist point of view is in developing theories that are testable, coming up with falsifiable claims, issuing hypotheses, and then demonstrating whether or not the evidence supports the hypotheses in question. Scientific instrumentalism, on the other hand, takes the approach that the point of models is to relate different states of affairs to one another. This has been the school of thought that I've been espousing throughout the first few weeks of this class. The scientific instrumentalist is oftentimes more concerned with trying to figure out where the patterns of interdependence are. What are the patterns? How do I know that two things are similar to one another enough that I can say that there's a pattern between them? Right now, there's a pattern on your screen, and that pattern you've come to know as Rob. But that's just a collection of pixels, right? I'm shooting in 4K. There's millions of pixels. Right now, there's a pattern of pixels that you have come to view as an image called Rob. But I'm so much more than that. Not really, right? But you've come to identify. But in order for that to be true, then you have to know, what are the brown pixels? What are the Rob skin-colored pixels? What are the white pixels? What are the gray pixels? What are the pink pixels? I'm not trying to embellish. You have to know which things are similar. You have to be able to identify a brown pixel from a brown pixel, a gray pixel from a gray pixel, a pink pixel from a pink pixel, a white pixel from a white pixel. You have to learn how to disentangle those things. You need a rule that tells you that two pixels are the same or different. If you can't tell that two pixels are similar in color, then you can't identify patterns, and therefore you can't know that this image that you see before me is something you should call Rob. So for an instrumentalist, the goal is to relate states of affairs so that instead of pixels being similar to pixels, phenomena are similar to phenomena. In order for me to be able to say that some collection of phenomena constitutes some pattern I ought to call peace, constitutes some pattern that I ought to call war, constitutes some pattern that I ought to call prosperity, whatever that is, whatever the combination of not pixels, but rather interactions is. I need to be able to liken interactions to interactions the same way that you need to be able to liken pixels to pixels. For an instrumentalist, therefore, it is less important to be able to measure quantities and test claims, and much more important to identify useful combinations, useful ways to relate phenomena to phenomena, useful, potentially interesting, memorable, succinct, simple would be best, simple ways to relate phenomena to phenomena so that we can identify patterns in those phenomena. I don't make apologies for teaching you from a particular point of view. I view a scientific realist oftentimes as completely wrong-headed, and so I don't think it's particularly controversial for me to teach you from a point of view, but I do think that it's important for me to let you know that there are in fact two schools of thought. The reason that I ask you this, however, is because I want to pose a question to you. Suppose that we had the prisoner's dilemma. Suppose we were thinking about the prisoner's dilemma. And suppose that our analysis of the prisoner's dilemma concluded that the prisoners both defect on one another. As a preview of coming attractions, that's going to be what winds up happening. I don't mean to spoil the punchline for you, but in the prisoner's dilemma, every way you slice it, the two prisoners tattle on one another. I write down a prisoner's dilemma, and I say, well, in every way that I look at this, the prisoners both defect on one another. And you say, well, I've decided I'm a scientific realist, and apparently that's something that you announce. You're not very fond of dinner parties. And you say, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to test your claim. Because you, my friend, are on the record now. You say to me, you're on the record, you wrote down a prisoner's dilemma, you said the prisoners are both going to defect, I'm going to issue a test of that hypothesis. So what do? You go to every precinct, you go to every police precinct in the country, and you collect data. Every time that the authorities put two suspects in two separate interrogation chambers and present the deal that was presented in the story of the prisoner's dilemma, every time that happens, you collect data. You find out what happens. Do the prisoners both defect on one another? Do they both stay silent? Does one stay silent and the other tattles, or vice versa? You get data on what happens, right? You're testing. You're a scientist. Look at you go. So now you have a spreadsheet. You have somewhere on your hard drive. There's an Excel spreadsheet entitled "Final Data, Prisoner Data 2.0, Final, no, really final this time, .csv." It says it right there. You have a data set. There's an Excel spreadsheet. Every row in the Excel spreadsheet is a different instance of two suspects being put into separate interrogation chambers and presented with the deal offered today. Right? Every row is one of those instantiations, and you have one column, and it's how often they both defect, how often they both tattle on one another. And suppose that you find out that 75% of the time, the prisoners both tattle on one another. Suppose you find that out. 75% of the time. That means that 25% of the time, something else happens. 25% of the time, they both stay silent, or one of the asymmetric outcomes happens where one tattles and the other doesn't. Suppose that you learn 75% of the time the prediction is correct, and 25% of the time the prediction is wrong. So what should we do? Is the prisoner's dilemma right? Have I confirmed it? Is the prisoner's dilemma wrong? Should I reject it? Is it both? Is it neither? Am I posing the wrong question? What was the goal of my enterprise, and what was the goal of your enterprise? And do our two enterprises have any ability to work together? I don't know the answer to this question. I'm asking you. Maybe you have some insights for me. 75% of the time I was right, and 25% of the time I was wrong. How'd I do? Can I test the theory in isolation? Do I know if that's good or bad just by itself? I mean, it's better than random guessing. So if I had just randomly guessed, then I would have a 1 in 4 chance of being right. 75% is pretty good. If I'm right 75% of the time, that's way better than just random guessing. But it's still worse than 100%. And I didn't have any ambiguity. I didn't condition my prediction. I didn't say, well, if it's a hot day, then they'll both tattle on one another because they want to get out of the hot room. And if it's a cold day, they won't mind as much. Or I didn't say, and if they're siblings, then they won't tattle on one another because they share DNA. I didn't say that. All I said was the two prisoners are both going to defect because of the way the deal was given. So maybe some of my mistakes were because I didn't factor in sibling effects, or temperature effects, or good cop, bad cop effects. Maybe I didn't factor in the fact that these two prisoners, these two suspects could have been visited by the ghost of Elvis. And Elvis said to them, hey, you know what you shouldn't do? You shouldn't tattle on one another. Both stay silent. So they both stayed silent because they both think that they saw Elvis. I didn't include any of that in my model. All I included was these two prisoners that got presented with the deal, which I took at face value. I didn't include brothers. I didn't include sisters. I didn't include Elvis. So was I right or was I wrong? Should I include Elvis? How fine-grained should my theory become? Should I interview every pair of prisoners that didn't both tattle on one another? Should I interview every pair of prisoners where that happened and ask them what happened? 1, yes, I should do that. That sounds like a really good way to do research. But 2, should I include everything that I learned? Should I include sibling effects? Should I include we've been in the same gang for a long time together effects? Probably so. Should I include environmental factors like temperature or whether or not there was good cop or bad cop? Potentially so. Should I include visits from ghosts of Elvis? Probably not. But how do I know what I should include and what I should not include? That's a tough question, right? All of this is far more subtle than my prisoner's dilemma was right or my prisoner's dilemma was wrong. Maybe my prisoner's dilemma was just a starting point as I try to get this fable right, but I have to figure out what the right balance is in terms of how hard to squeeze on these idiosyncratic factors versus how light of a touch to keep so I can explain lots of different processes. So if I'm taking a charitable interpretation toward the scientific realist point of view, then testing the prisoner's dilemma is still a flawed enterprise, but potentially a promising one so long as I maintain delicate balances, so long as I solve Goldilocks problems, so long as I find Aristotelian means between the extremes. So that's a charitable interpretation. An uncharitable interpretation is the following. Why the f*** did you think I was thinking about prisoners to begin with? Why the f*** did you ask prisoners about that? Why the f*** are you insulting my intelligence by thinking that I'm talking about two suspects in hypothetical interrogation chambers when the whole time I was talking about two countries thinking about whether or not to develop nuclear weapons? My task was never to get prisoners right in the first place. It was to relate different states of affairs. Somewhere in between the charitable interpretation and the uncharitable interpretation lives any number of potential happy medians. I say this because it seems to me that many people struggle with this model is the best guess that we have at the moment versus this model doesn't perform as well as we would like. Of course, at the moment, epidemiological models are on a lot of people's minds. A lot of people have wondered about how well to predict the growth of particular diseases, which will go unnamed. A model can perform badly and still be the best in class. And a model can perform well and still not be the best in class. Some models are useful for prediction. Other models are useful for explanation. Some models are useful for introductory examples. Other models are useful for very fine-grained details. Some models are for specialists and some are for generalists. Some models zoom in on very particular factors like Elvis visits, and others zoom out and try to keep things very parsimonious so that we can explain things in the most general way possible. There's all sorts of different approaches to predicting disease expansion, and some of them are good and some of them are bad depending on what our goals are at any particular moment. So even if I'm being a realist, even if I think that I'm modeling the thing that I think that I'm modeling, even if I'm doing that, I have to make tough choices. And of course, it goes without saying that because of all of this conditioning on all of the different purposes that I might choose a given model for, I must remain humble in my interpretations. So not only must I be charitable to other interpretations of what I am doing, I must be humble in my own interpretations of what I am doing. There are many reasons to privilege the instrumentalist view over the realist view and vice versa. But one particularly appealing reason to think about instrumentalism is because there's something very important about storytelling in the human experience. I don't know about you, but I love good storytellers. A lot of the best memories in my life are of watching. Everybody in my family is a pretty good storyteller, and watching them tell stories is hilarious. Everybody in my family, first of all, we all make fun of one another constantly, which is to say we just talk about one another honestly. And so this is just something where a lot of people that are very close to me are very good at this. And so I don't know, I just think that storytelling is a lot of fun. I think there's something particularly human about it. And I think that one really fun way to think about all of this mathematical stuff and the fables and everything is to think about the Odyssey by Homer. So the Odyssey didn't happen, right? The Odyssey is a fantasy story. Odysseus, whether or not there was actually a king of Ithaca named Odysseus, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think it is. But there is no Odysseus who, after some Trojan war that lasted 10 years, then took 10 more years to get home, and his wife Penelope waited for him even though she was fighting off suitors, and her son Telemachus was trying to become a man during the whole process, and along the way, Odysseus and his sailors and the people fighting his army, they didn't really get attacked by sirens. There wasn't really a sea monster. There wasn't really a whirlpool. There weren't lotus eaters. Things in the Odyssey didn't really happen. If you read the Odyssey, literally, you're not going to have a great time. But if you view it as a parable for how important it is to get home after facing an arduous task, if you view it about what it is to overcome trials, seemingly random trials put forth by seemingly capricious gods, if you view it that way, it isn't very hard to relate to Odysseus because we've all had to make it home after an arduous task. It isn't very hard to relate to Penelope because we've all had to wait for somebody that we care about. It isn't very hard to relate to Telemachus because we've all tried to come of age under hard circumstances. You more than most. I had to come of age in the 90s, which means I had to come of age even though Smash Mouth was happening. So I had it hard too. It isn't very hard to relate to people if we view their state of affairs as relatable to our state of affairs. It isn't hard. And it's part of what we do. When we tell stories, it isn't because we actually care about lotus eaters or Scylla or Charybdis. We don't care about any of that. We care about telling a story in a memorable way that allows us to relate to the characters in the hopes that we can learn from them. Why am I talking about this? It's because if you view storytelling as an important part of the human experience, then it is especially interesting that game theory and other forms of mathematical modeling in the social sciences allow us to do something that is deeply human for us in telling stories, but it enables us to tell them in a way that is scientifically useful. That's a breakthrough. That's a huge breakthrough. To take something that we already do ordinarily, like tell stories. It wasn't hard for you to be intrigued by the Prisoner's Dilemma story, or the arms race story, or the Bach or Stravinsky story, because you've lived an experience like that before. The fact that that wasn't hard for you, then the encoding act becomes just the act of taking something natural like a story and turning it into something scientifically useful. If you look at it that way, then you can't help but be overwhelmed by the beauty of this approach. Because not only do we have an opportunity to relate to different states of affairs to one another, but we have a chance to do so in such a deeply human way. So even if you never find yourself at a whiteboard or in front of a camera like this, even if you never find yourself doing game theory or any other mathematical modeling in your life, I hope that you'll become a storyteller. Why? Because it's fun. and because it's human. Thanks for watching.